The hallway backstage was narrow and cold, lit by a single bulb that flickered every few seconds like it was trying to decide whether to give up. Jackson Browne stood with his back against the wall, hands shoved deep in his pockets, staring at a door 15 feet away. Behind that door was Joni Mitchell. He could hear her voice, muffled but unmistakable, talking to someone he couldn't see. He'd been standing there for maybe 10 minutes, maybe longer. Time felt strange when you were trying to decide whether to knock. He didn't knock. The venue was somewhere in Northern California, a college auditorium that smelled like old wood and dust and the faint chemical tang of stage makeup. The show had ended an hour ago. Most of the crew had already packed up and left. A few stragglers lingered near the loading dock, smoking cigarettes and talking in low voices. Jackson had told himself he was just waiting for a ride, that he had no reason to be standing in this hallway, that he should leave, but he didn't leave. He stayed, because he knew this might be the last chance he'd get. And he didn't know if that mattered or if it was already too late. 3 months earlier, they'd been in the same room without the wait. 3 months earlier, they'd been something close to friends. Not close in the way people use the word now, not inseparable or bound by some unspoken pact. But close enough. They'd written songs in the same circles, played the same clubs, shared the same cramped green rooms and bad coffee and long nights where the music mattered more than sleep. There was a respect between them, an understanding, the kind you didn't have to name because it was just there, built into the way they listened to each other, the way they made space. But something had shifted. Not all at once, not in a single moment you could point to and say, that's when it broke. It was quieter than that, more like a crack that started small and spread slowly until one day you looked up and realized the whole thing was fractured. And you couldn't remember exactly when it happened. It started with a song. Jackson had written it months before, late at night in a basement apartment in Los Angeles, sitting on the floor with his guitar and a notebook that was more doodles than words. The song wasn't about anyone in particular, or at least that's what he told himself. It was just a feeling he was trying to capture, a sense of longing and confusion and the strange ache that came from wanting something you couldn't name. He played it for a few people. They liked it. One of them suggested he record it. He did. And when it came out, people started asking questions. Who's it about? He never answered directly, just shrugged and said it was personal. But the questions kept coming. And somewhere along the way, someone decided it was about Joni. He didn't know who started the rumor. Didn't know if it came from a journalist or a promoter or just some fan who thought they'd figured it out. But once it was out there, it stuck. And the more he denied it, the more people seemed convinced it was true. Joni heard about it. Of course she did. In circles that small, everyone heard everything eventually. And when she heard, she didn't call him, didn't confront him, didn't ask if it was true. She just stopped answering his calls, stopped showing up to the same venues, stopped acknowledging him when their paths crossed in passing. It was like he'd become invisible to her. Or worse, like he'd become something she didn't want to see. He tried once to talk to her. Caught her outside a club in Laurel Canyon, called her name as she was walking to her car. She stopped, turned around, looked at him with an expression he couldn't read. Not anger, not hurt. Just something flat and distant, like she was looking at a stranger. Joni, I need to explain. There's nothing to explain, she said. Her voice was calm, too calm. The kind of calm that meant the conversation was already over before it started. It's not about you. The song. People are saying, I don't care what people are saying, Jackson. I care that you let them say it. He didn't know what to say to that. Because she was right. He could have shut it down, could have made a statement, could have corrected the record, could have done something. But he didn't. And the truth was, he didn't know why. Maybe because part of him liked the attention. Maybe because part of him thought it didn't matter. Maybe because he was a coward. He didn't know. And standing there in the parking lot with her looking at him like that, he realized it didn't matter what the reason was. The damage was done. She got in her car and drove away. He stood there watching the taillights disappear and felt something hollow open up in his chest. That was 2 months ago. Since then, he'd heard through mutual friends that she was angry. Not just at him, but at the whole situation. At the way people used her name like a piece of gossip. At the way her private life had become public currency. At the way men in the industry seemed to think they had the right to write about her, sing about her, claim pieces of her without asking. She was tired of it, and Jackson, whether he meant to or not, had become part of that. He understood, or at least he thought he did. But understanding didn't make it easier. It just made the guilt heavier. Now, standing in this hallway, he didn't know what he was hoping for. An apology wouldn't fix it. An explanation wouldn't change anything. But he felt like he owed her something, even if that something was just the acknowledgement that he'd screwed up, that he'd been careless, that he was sorry. The door opened. Joni stepped out, carrying a canvas bag over her shoulder and a jacket draped over one arm. She was wearing jeans and a loose sweater, her hair pulled back in a way that made her look younger than she was. She saw him immediately. Stopped. For a second, neither of them moved, just stood there in the flickering light, 15 feet apart, with the weight of 3 months pressing down on the space between them. Jackson. Her voice was neutral, not warm, not cold, just his name. Hey, he pulled his hands out of his pockets, then didn't know what to do with them. Let them hang at his sides. I was hoping I could talk to you. About what? About everything. The song. The rumors. The way I handled it. She shifted the bag on her shoulder, glanced down the hallway like she was calculating how quickly she could leave. It's late, Jackson. I know. I need you to know I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I believe you. She said it quickly. Too quickly. Like she'd already decided what she thought and didn't need to hear the rest. Then why won't you talk to me? She looked at him then. Really looked at him. And for the first time he saw something other than distance in her eyes. Not anger, not hurt, just exhaustion. The kind that came from carrying something too heavy for too long. Because it doesn't matter if you meant it or not, she said. It happened. And you let it happen. And now every time someone hears that song, they think about me. They think they know something about me. About my life. About who I am. And I didn't get a say in that. You took that from me. Maybe you didn't mean to. But you did. He wanted to argue. Wanted to tell her she was wrong, that it wasn't like that the song wasn't even about her. But the words stuck in his throat. Because deep down, he knew. Maybe it wasn't about her. But it didn't matter. Once people decided it became about her. And he'd let that happen. He'd stayed silent when he should have spoken. And that silence had cost more than he'd realized. I'm sorry, he said. It sounded small, inadequate. But it was all he had. She nodded, not in acceptance, just in acknowledgement. I know. I don't know. Start over? Forget all this? She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. No, Jackson, we can't. Why not? Because some things don't get undone. You can apologize, you can mean it. But that doesn't erase what already happened. It doesn't give me back what I lost. He didn't know what to say to that. Didn't know how to argue with something that felt so final. So he just stood there, feeling the distance between them grow, even though neither of them had moved. I have to go, she said. She adjusted the bag on her shoulder and started walking toward the exit. He watched her go, every step feeling like a door closing. She was almost to the end of the hallway when she stopped, turned back, looked at him one more time. For what it's worth, she said, I don't think you're a bad person. I just think you didn't think, and sometimes that's worse. Then she was gone. Jackson stood there for a long time after she left. The flickering bulb above him finally gave up and went dark, leaving him in shadows. He could hear voices from outside, the sound of engines starting, the low hum of the night settling in. He thought about following her, thought about trying one more time. But he knew it wouldn't change anything. The conversation was over. Maybe it had been over before it even started. He walked out of the venue into the parking lot. The air was cool and damp, the kind that clung to your skin and made everything feel heavier. A few people were still loading equipment into a van. Someone called his name, asked if he needed a ride. He waved them off, said he'd find his own way. He walked for a while, not toward anything, just away. The streets were empty and quiet, lined with trees that rustled in the breeze. He thought about the song, about the way it had felt when he wrote it, like he was pulling something true out of the air and pinning it down on paper, about the way it felt now, like it belonged to someone else, like it had been taken from him and twisted into something he didn't recognize. He thought about Joni, about the way she'd looked at him in the hallway, about the exhaustion in her eyes, about the way she'd said some things don't get undone. He wondered if she was right, wondered if there was a point where apologies stopped mattering, where intent stopped being enough, where the only thing left was the consequence. He didn't have an answer. Months passed. Then, years. He kept making music. So did she. They crossed paths occasionally, at festivals, at award shows, at industry events where everyone smiled and shook hands and pretended the past didn't exist. But they never spoke. Not really. Just polite nods from across the room. Brief acknowledgments that felt more like rituals than real connection. People asked him about it sometimes, interviewers mostly. They'd bring up the old rumors, ask if there was truth to them, try to get him to spill something juicy. He always deflected, said it was ancient history, said people read too much into things, said he didn't remember the details anymore, but he did remember. He remembered all of it. The hallway, the flickering light, the way she'd looked at him like he was someone she used to know, the way she'd said some things don't get undone. He remembered because it was the moment he realized that being sorry wasn't the same as being forgiven. That meaning well wasn't the same as doing right. That you could lose someone not through malice or cruelty, but through carelessness, through the small, thoughtless choices that seemed insignificant at the time but added up to something you couldn't take back. He wondered if she thought about it too, if she remembered that night, if it mattered to her the way it mattered to him. He didn't know. He never asked. And as the years went on, the window for asking closed. The silence became its own answer. One night, years later, he was at a small venue in New York, sitting in the audience watching a young singer-songwriter perform. The kid was good, raw, unpolished, the kind of real that made you pay attention. Between songs, the kid told a story about a relationship that had ended badly, about how he'd written a song about it, about how the other person had heard it and stopped speaking to him. The kid laughed when he said it, like it was funny, like it was just part of the territory. Jackson didn't laugh. He just sat there, feeling something old and familiar rise up in his chest. And he realized that the kid didn't get it yet, didn't understand what he'd lost, didn't know that some doors, once closed, stayed closed, that some people, once gone, didn't come back, that you could spend the rest of your life wishing you'd done things differently and it wouldn't change a single thing. After the show, the kid came up to him, starstruck and eager, asked for advice, asked what it took to make it in this business. Jackson looked at him for a long moment, thought about all the things he could say, all the lessons he'd learned the hard way, all the warnings he could offer that probably wouldn't be heard. Finally, he said, "Be careful with people's stories. They're not yours to tell." The kid nodded, but Jackson could tell he didn't really understand. Not yet. How could he? You can't learn some things secondhand. You have to live them. You have to lose something you can't get back. You have to stand in a cold hallway and watch someone walk away and know it's your fault. Jackson shook the kid's hand and left the venue. Outside, the city was loud and bright and full of people moving in all directions. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, hands in his pockets, watching the crowd. Somewhere out there, Joni was living her life, making her music, carrying her own stories, and he was here. And the distance between them was more than miles. It was years of silence, years of things left unsaid, years of a friendship that had ended not with a fight or a betrayal, but with a quiet, irreversible fracture. He thought about the hallway again, about the way she'd looked at him, about the way she'd said, "Some things don't get undone." She'd been right. He started walking, not toward anything, just forward, into the night, into the noise, into whatever came next, carrying the weight of what he'd lost and the knowledge that he'd lost it through his own carelessness. Not cruelty, not malice, just the thoughtless assumption that sorry would be enough. That people would wait. That damage could always be repaired if you meant well. But meaning well wasn't enough. It never had been, and by the time he'd learned that, it was already too late. The door had closed. The silence had settled. And all that was left was the echo of a friendship that had ended in a cold hallway under a flickering light, with words that couldn't be taken back and apologies that couldn't undo what had already been done. He kept walking. And somewhere, in another part of the city, so did she.